Some cars disappear and almost no one notices. And then there's the Volkswagen Beetle, a car that appeared in movies, on album covers, in millions of family photos, and on the streets of practically every continent. You don't need to read the name, you don't need to see the logo. A silhouette is enough. And yet, Volkswagen decided to eliminate it. It didn't disappear because no one wanted it. It didn't disappear because it stopped being sold.
Welcome to Autoledger.
It disappeared when it had already become a legend. In July 2019, Volkswagen manufactured the last Beetle in the world. The last heir to a story that had begun more than 8 decades earlier and had produced more than 21 million units. A car known in every language. A car that survived wars, economic crises, and generational changes. And yet it disappeared. The question is, how does one of the most beloved cars in history end up dying? What we're going to discover today isn't just the story of a car. It's the story of how a brand can build something the whole world loves and still decide to kill it. It's the story of the regulations that officially sealed its fate and the corporate decision that actually signed its death warrant. Because, as is so often the case in the automotive industry, the publicly stated reason and the real reason weren't exactly the same. It all begins in an awkward place. The Beetle wasn't born in a Silicon Valley garage or in the dream of an idealistic engineer. It was commissioned by Adolf Hitler. In 1934, the German Chancellor entrusted Ferdinand Porsche with a very specific mission: to design a car that any working-class family could afford. It had to be simple, durable, and inexpensive to maintain, a true people's car. Porsche had been pursuing a similar idea for years. Hitler gave him the resources to make it a reality. But just when the project was ready to take off, World War II broke out. The factory that was supposed to produce the new car was converted to military equipment, and the car was put on hold before its story even began. When the war ended, the facilities came under British control. An officer named Ivan Hurst found the abandoned prototypes and made an unexpected decision: to give them a chance. Most major manufacturers of the time saw no future in that small, oddly shaped car. Some even rejected the possibility of producing it. It seemed destined for oblivion. But they were about to make one of the biggest mistakes in the history of the automotive industry. Because just a few years later, that car that nobody wanted started selling millions of units worldwide. What happened in the following years is one of the most extraordinary marketing phenomena in automotive history. In 1949, the Beetle arrived in the United States. At first, nobody wanted it. Americans were enamored with their large chrome sedans, those steel behemoths that looked like spaceships parked in suburban garages. A small, round car without a radiator didn't fit into that landscape. But in 1959, something happened that changed everything. The advertising agency Doyle Dane Bernbach launched a campaign that broke with all conventions. Think small. Minimalist ads, intelligent humor, brutal honesty about the car's limitations. In an era when car advertising promised power, speed, and glamour, Volkswagen promised the exact opposite. It worked in a way no one expected. By the end of the 1950s, the Beetle was no longer the car of the eccentric foreigner. It was the car of the college student, the artist, the person who thought differently. It was the symbol of a generation that rejected excess and embraced simplicity. Teachers, musicians, activists bought it. People who didn't want a car to impress, but to get around. By 1968, Volkswagen had sold 563,522 units in the United States alone. That year, the Beetle became the best-selling car in the world. And that same year, Disney released The Love Bug, a film in which a beetle named Herbie had magical powers and won Formula One races. The film was a massive success. A year later, in 1969, 4 musicians walked across a London street for an album cover. Behind them, parked on the corner, was a white Beetle. The album was called Abbey Road. The musicians were the Beatles, and the image became one of the most recognizable photographs of the 20th century. The Beetle wasn't just a car, it was a cultural symbol of the highest order. On February 17, 1972, the 15,007,034th Beetle rolled off the assembly line in Wolfsburg. With that number, the Beetle surpassed the Ford Model T as the most produced car in history up to that point. It was a historic day. The factory workers celebrated. It seemed impossible that something like that could disappear. And perhaps the most surprising thing is that for millions of people, the Beetle was never a special car. It was simply their car. The car they learned to drive in. The car that waited in front of their house every morning. The car for family vacations. The car that started even when it seemed impossible. For many people, it didn't represent luxury or status. It represented something much harder to come by: reliability. And that's precisely why what happened next was so difficult to accept. Because when a car is part of the daily lives of several generations, you assume it will always be there. But it wasn't. But here's something that almost no one remembers. That same year, the Beetle was breaking production records. Sales in the United States were already starting to decline. It wasn't for lack of love. It was for something colder, more technical, and deep down, more inevitable. The Beetle's engine was an air-cooled 4-cylinder boxer. No radiator, no coolant, no water pump. A marvel of simplicity that any neighborhood mechanic could fix by hand. But that engine, designed in the 1930s, had a problem that by 1972 could no longer be ignored. Its polluting emissions were incompatible with the new environmental regulations that the United States was progressively tightening. Volkswagen tried to adapt the engine. They added catalytic converters, modified the carburetor. But there was a physical limit that couldn't be crossed without redesigning the engine from scratch. In 1977, after selling approximately 5 million units in the American market, the classic Beetle was banned in the United States for failing to meet emissions and safety standards. 5 million units, decades of presence, and overnight gone. And this is where the story takes an unexpected turn. Because when the United States closed its doors, the Beetle found a second home. And that home would ultimately determine its fate. But the story didn't end there. Because while the United States was closing its doors, another market kept them open: Mexico. In 1954, the Beetle arrived in Mexico as part of an exhibition at the UNAM's University City campus. The press covered it as if it were a national event. And in a way, it was. In 1967, Volkswagen inaugurated its plant in Puebla, and the Beetle began to be manufactured on Mexican soil. What happened then is unparalleled in automotive history. In Mexico, the Beetle wasn't simply popular, it became something else. A defining element of the city. In 1971, the government of the Federal District chose it as the official taxi of Mexico City, green with a white roof, no front passenger seat, so the passenger could get in without difficulty. The taximeter was on top of the dashboard. By the mid-1990s, there were more than 100,000 Beetle taxis circulating in Mexico City alone. It was the largest fleet of a single taxi model in any city in the world. One car, an entire city. But while the Beetle continued to dominate Mexican streets, an uncomfortable question was beginning to surface within Volkswagen. The company was no longer the same one that had built its reputation on that small air-cooled car. Now it had more modern models, more profitable, and much easier to adapt to new international regulations. On the surface, the Beetle still seemed indispensable. But inside some offices, it was beginning to be seen as a relic difficult to justify. It wasn't an urgent problem yet, but the seed had been planted. Meanwhile, in the rest of Latin America, it lived by 15 different names. Fusca in Brazil, Escarabajo in Argentina and Chile, Cucaracha in Guatemala and Honduras, Cepillo in the Dominican Republic, Peta in Bolivia, Sapito in Peru. One continent, 15 names, the same affection in different accents. A car that needed no translation, that in each country had found its own name, its own place, its own story. No marketing campaign can achieve that. Only time can. However, another problem was quietly brewing. In the mid-1990s, Japanese and Korean manufacturers began flooding the Latin American market with modern subcompacts, 4 doors, airbags, electronically fuel-injected engines that effortlessly met emissions standards. In 1996, the Chevrolet Pop arrived, costing only slightly more than the Beetle and offering everything the Beetle couldn't. Sales plummeted. The 40,000 units sold annually in the mid-1990s dropped to 10,000 by 2000. But the Beetle still had one stronghold: taxis. As long as Mexico City taxi drivers continued to choose it, the Puebla plant had a reason to exist. It was the last real market-sustaining production, the only one. That stronghold fell in 2002. Andrés Manuel López Obrador, then head of government of the Federal District, issued a decree prohibiting the granting of new taxi permits to 2-door cars. The justification was common sense. A 4-door car is more comfortable for the passenger, makes getting in and out easier, and allows for easier loading of luggage. The Beetle, with its 2-door design, was excluded from the new taxi market. Existing permits would remain valid until their expiration date, but they would not be renewed. There would be no more Beetle taxis in Mexico City. Sales plummeted, falling far short of the 40,000 units sold annually a decade earlier. Without the taxi market, the Puebla plant's profitability plummeted. There was no way to sustain a production line with those figures. In March 2003, Volkswagen officially announced the end of production of the classic Beetle in Puebla, Mexico. The official reason was a drop in demand, and the drop in demand was real. But it wasn't enough to explain what happened, because the underlying reason was something else. Volkswagen in 2003 was a different company than it had been in 1968. It had the Golf, the Jetta, the Passat, the Touareg. It had models with much higher margins, broader markets, younger and more profitable customers. The classic Beetle was an honest and beloved car, but with narrow margins, 1930s technology, and a customer base dependent on a single market in a single country. Modernizing it to meet 21st century standards would have required a huge investment. A new engine, a new safety structure, a complete redesign. The result would have been a different car competing in an already saturated segment. Volkswagen made the decision. It wasn't worth investing in saving something that no longer fit into their overall strategy. Regulations were the publicly stated reason. Profitability was the reason discussed behind closed doors. As is almost always the case in the automotive industry, both were true, but not to the same degree. Because in the end, the Beetle didn't die because it was a bad car. It died because it stopped being a good business. On July 30th, 2003, the last classic Beetle rolled off the assembly line at the Puebla plant. It was the 21,529,464th unit manufactured since production began. It was painted blue and a commemorative plaque was affixed. The line workers silently accompanied it. Volkswagen prepared a special farewell edition, 2,999 numbered units, priced higher than the standard model. They sold out in days. The last Beetle didn't stay in Mexico. It crossed the Atlantic and was sent to the Volkswagen Historical Museum in Wolfsburg, Germany. The country that had invented it, that had seen it rejected by everyone, that had seen it conquer the world, welcomed it back to be kept as a relic. Mexico, which had been its last home for decades, bid it farewell with a mariachi band playing on the production line. In 1998, Volkswagen launched the new Beetle, a modern redesign based on the Golf platform, with a front-mounted engine and water cooling instead of air. It had the rounded silhouette of the original, but inside it was a completely different car. It was well received and sold reasonably well, but it never generated the same emotional connection as the original. In 2012, the third generation arrived, the Beetle F5, more stylish and modern. It too failed to replicate the magic. In July 2019, Volkswagen manufactured the last of those modern Beetles. Also in Puebla. Also the last in the world. The plant that had given life to the Beetle for more than 50 years buried it twice. Today, the classic Beetles that remain on the road are cult objects. Limited editions, well-preserved models, and those restored with original parts have multiplied their value several times over. Collector clubs in Mexico, Germany, Brazil, the United States, and throughout Europe keep them alive with the same devotion others show for art or history. Volkswagen, the company that decided it wasn't worth investing in modernizing it, has spent years studying how to bring it back. The ID Buzz, launched in 2022, is essentially an electric Volkswagen van designed as a direct homage to that spirit. And rumors are circulating about an electric concept that would revive the Beetle's silhouette. A brand that killed its greatest icon because it wasn't profitable enough is now spending money to recover the essence of that icon because the market never stopped demanding it. The automotive industry has this habit. First, it abandons what doesn't generate enough profit. Then it spends twice as much trying to recover what people never forgot. The Beetle has been in the collective memory of half the world for over 80 years. In the memories of those who drove it, in the films that immortalized it, in the photographs that captured it, in the streets of cities that adopted it as their own without anyone asking. That's not manufactured in a factory. That's earned over decades, mile by mile, generation after generation. Most cars disappear and hardly anyone notices. The Beetle disappeared years ago, and yet we're still talking about it. If you found this interesting, I'll leave another video on screen that's sure to surprise you.